The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged peaks that bordered the town, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. Dust swirled along the empty street, stirred by the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the wooden buildings like an uninvited ghost. In the midst of the quiet chaos, a lone figure appeared, stumbling forward with unsteady steps. Her bare feet pressed against the rough, splintered boards of the walkway, each step leaving a small imprint in the fine layer of dust. The town, usually bustling with the murmurs of horse hooves and traders' calls, seemed to hold its breath as she moved. Her clothes were torn and caked with dirt, the fabric hanging loosely on her frame. Her skin, once fair, was now mottled with bruises that bloomed in shades of purple and yellow, dark against the pallor of her arms and legs. A sleeve had ripped down the shoulder, revealing the tender mark of a handprint, fresh and angry against the delicate curve of her collarbone. She moved as if each step demanded more courage than the last, and the small sigh she let out sounded like a whisper lost in the wind. "Don't look at me," she murmured under her breath, as though saying it aloud could make the entire town suddenly remember some hidden cruelty or shame. Her voice was soft, cracked in places, a fragile thing that barely carried over the dry, dusty air. It wasn't a plea to the town, or to anyone she might meet. It was a command she gave to herself, a desperate shield against the eyes she imagined upon her. Her head bowed low, a veil of dark, tangled hair hiding most of her face, though the glint of swollen eyes betrayed the trail of tears she had shed not long before. Her feet dragged slightly, catching on the uneven boards, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a storefront railing. The wood was rough against her palms, scraping them raw, but she ignored it, focusing only on moving forward. Each breath came shallow and fast, a ragged rhythm that mirrored the panic that had taken residence in her chest. She was aware of every sound, the distant creak of a sign swinging in the wind, the whisper of boots against the boards behind her, but she didn't dare look. To meet anyone's gaze was to risk exposure, and exposure meant everything she had tried to escape might find her again. The town, usually noisy with life, seemed eerily silent, as if it too sensed her fragility. The shutters of the buildings hung unevenly, flapping lazily in the wind, the scent of baked bread and leather mingling faintly with the dust. No one called out to her. No children ran by laughing. The absence of attention was almost a comfort, a muted acknowledgment of her desire to remain invisible. Yet the loneliness pressed down on her as heavily as the bruises that ached with every step. She could feel the weight of the world pressing in from all sides, a silent force urging her to vanish, to hide, to disappear into the shadows that grew longer with the setting sun. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories she couldn't quiet. Harsh voices, a hand raised in anger, doors slammed, and the relentless fear that had driven her from her home. Every step she took in this new place carried the residue of that terror, each footprint a mark of survival. And yet, beneath the trembling and the fear, there was a fragile thread of determination. She had escaped. She had survived. But for now, survival meant hiding, keeping herself small, and hoping that whatever past pursued her would not find her here. She paused near the center of the street, leaning against a wooden post, closing her eyes briefly to block the pain radiating from her bruises. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. "Don't look at me," she whispered again, almost a prayer this time, a desperate plea to remain unseen, to stay unnoticed, to avoid the judgment she imagined was already written in the eyes of strangers. Her bare feet dug into the dust as if trying to root herself to the ground, seeking a sense of stability in a world that had been anything but kind. And in that quiet moment, with the sun bleeding across the horizon and the wind carrying the scent of the open prairie, she allowed herself to be entirely vulnerable, unseen but aware, waiting for something she could not yet name. The sound of hooves against the dry dirt road broke the uneasy silence, and she flinched instinctively, pressing herself closer to the rough wooden post. Her heart raced, and for a moment she feared it was someone who had followed her from the place she had fled. But as the figure emerged from the haze of dust and sunlight, her panic shifted confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, cautious hope. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to the land rather than the confines of the town. His boots raised small clouds of dust with each step, and the brim of his hat shadowed a face weathered by sun and wind but softened by kind eyes. He didn't shout or stare. He didn't approach with the swagger of the townsfolk who were quick to judge newcomers. Instead, he slowed, observing quietly, his gaze steady yet gentle, like a calm current waiting for the storm to pass. The woman's first instinct was to shrink further into herself, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She could feel the bruises on her arms and legs burning with each heartbeat, and the ache in her chest made it hard to breathe evenly. "Don't look at me," she whispered again, almost inaudibly, and her fingers curled around the post as if it could shield her from him. She had spent so long hiding, running, and pretending that if she could just avoid anyone's eyes, she could escape the judgment, the cruelty, and the fear that had dogged her every step. But he didn't look at her with judgment. His eyes softened as he knelt slightly to adjust the stirrup of his horse, careful not to make any sudden movements. There was no mockery, no curiosity laced with disdain, only awareness. And somehow, that awareness felt safe. She wanted to look away, wanted to turn and flee down the dusty road, but something rooted her in place, a strange and unfamiliar trust. The townspeople seemed to sense it too. From their windows and doorways, cautious eyes peeked out, but no one dared step forward. The air hung heavy with the quiet tension of unspoken questions, of whispered suspicions, yet he remained unbothered by the town's collective wariness. For a moment, he became the only presence that mattered, the only thing that existed beyond her bruised body and her trembling spirit. He took a slow step closer, and she instinctively drew back. Not in fear of him, though she had learned long ago to expect harm from strangers, but in fear of exposure, of having to face someone who might see her scars, her brokenness, her vulnerability. Yet he didn't advance aggressively. Instead, he stopped at a distance that respected her space. His posture relaxed, his eyes still fixed on hers without pressure. There was patience in him, the kind of patience that doesn't demand answers or explanations. The wind shifted, sending her hair across her face, and he reached into his pocket, not to touch her, but to pull out a small handkerchief. His movements were deliberate, slow, and careful, offering her a choice without words. It was a simple gesture, and yet, to her, it spoke volumes. It said, without speaking, "I am aware of you. I see your pain, and I do not intend to add to it." Her pulse thundered in her ears, and for the first time since she had arrived in town, she felt the possibility of relief, however small, brush against her ragged nerves. The world was still dangerous, still uncertain, but here was someone who seemed to notice her without wanting to exploit her. Someone who might, perhaps, understand what it meant to be bruised and bare, yet still carry the strength to kneel in respect rather than tower in judgment. She didn't take the handkerchief immediately. Instead, she watched him, hesitant, wary, yet a fraction of the tension within her eased. For the first time, she felt that the weight of her solitude could be shared, even just a little. And as he waited, patiently and silently, the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, bathing both of them in golden light. As if the world itself had paused to mark this fragile moment of connection. It was here, in this quiet, unspeaking acknowledgement of her pain, that the first thread of trust began to form a fragile, tentative bridge between a woman desperate to remain unseen and a man willing to see her anyway. She froze where she stood, the wind tugging at her tangled hair, sending stray strands across her tear-streaked face. Her bare feet ached against the rough wooden boards of the street, each grain pressing into the bruises on her solace. The rancher remained still, just a few paces away, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, as though every movement was measured not to startle her. Her instinct screamed at her to flee. Years of fear had trained her body to react the moment a stranger approached. But her muscles were tired, her body screaming from long hours of running, hiding, and carrying the invisible weight of trauma. She swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. Her voice, when it emerged, was barely more than a rasp. "I said, don't look at me." He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands defensively, didn't take a step back, didn't speak over her, as if her words were not a command to be argued with, but a warning to be respected. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady yet soft, and spoke quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, the words slow, deliberate, and weighted with sincerity. "I just want to help." Nothing more. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the shadows of the buildings lining the street. She had learned long ago that promises could be broken, that kindness could disguise cruelty, and that trust was a luxury she could not afford. Her chest tightened, and tears threatened to spill again, uninvited. She gripped the wooden post beside her, fingernails digging into the splintered surface as if it could anchor her to the ground and prevent her from collapsing. Under the weight of fear, the rancher's hand shifted slightly, not toward her but toward a small satchel hanging from his saddle. He didn't speak. His eyes never left hers, patient and unthreatening. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled a clean handkerchief from the bag and extended it toward her. It was a small, seemingly insignificant gesture, yet in that moment, it spoke volumes. It said, "I see you. I am aware of your pain, and I will not add to it." She recoiled slightly, unsure whether it was safe to accept his offering. The simple act of taking the cloth felt monumental, as though by touching it, she would be exposing herself in ways she had fought to prevent. Her body trembled, a mixture of fear and exhaustion, the battle between self-preservation and the faintest flicker of hope waging silently within her. I can't," she started, her voice trembling. "You can," he interrupted gently, his voice soft and calm, almost coaxing. "You don't have to say anything. Just take it if you want. I'm not asking for more than you can give." His words, simple as they were, cut through the layers of armor she had built around herself. They were not demands, not judgments. They were an acknowledgment of her autonomy, her pain, and her right to choose. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and accepted the handkerchief. Her fingers brushed his briefly, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dust, wood, and a faint trace of leather from his coat. She pressed the cloth to her lips, wiping at the dried streaks of tears on her face. The gesture was private, tentative, and yet profoundly symbolic. It was a small act of surrender, not to him, not yet, but to the possibility that she might not have to face the world entirely alone. Her eyes, swollen and raw, flickered up to meet his. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a tentative glance that was not filled with fear, shame, or dread. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost lost to the wind. He nodded slightly, a quiet affirmation as if to say, "I understand." And in that silent acknowledgement, something shifted. The tension that had coiled tightly around her chest began to loosen, if only a fraction. She was still wary. She was still bruised and barefoot, still carrying the weight of her past. But for the first time, she sensed that the presence of another human being could be more than a threat. It could be a refuge. He took another careful step forward, not to close the distance forcefully, but to meet her where she was, to match her pace of trust rather than demand it. "We don't have to go anywhere right now," he said. You can rest here as long as you need. I'll be right here. She blinked rapidly, the words sinking in. Rest. Someone offering rest without strings, without judgment. The concept felt foreign, almost dangerous in its gentleness. Yet, the sheer simplicity of it began to anchor her in the present. She no longer felt as though the world was pressing in on all sides. In this moment, in the quiet street with the wind stirring dust around them, there was a fragile space where she could exist without fear, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. As she sat on the edge of the dusty boardwalk, clutching the handkerchief to her chest, the quiet of the street allowed memories to rise unbidden, like shadows stirred by the evening sun. Her eyes, still raw from crying, glazed slightly as the world around her blurred. It wasn't a conscious choice to remember. It was as if the past itself had been waiting, ready to spill over the fragile barrier she had built around her mind. She saw it first as shapes. A room dimly lit by a single swinging lamp. The walls pressed close, the air thick with anger and fear. A voice, low and sharp, cut through the darkness like a whip. She flinched even in memory, her body remembering the reflexes long after the danger had passed. The hands that had struck her were no longer present in the street outside the rancher's gaze, but the phantom pain lingered. Bruises that had faded in color remained vivid in her mind, each one a mark not only of violence but of the helplessness she had felt in its wake. It had started subtly small slaps disguised as discipline. Words meant to chip away at her confidence and reshape her into someone smaller, quieter, more pliable. At first, she thought she could endure it, that perhaps submission would grant her safety. But the fear escalated quickly, growing like an insidious weed. Doors slammed when she entered the room, voices yelled, and the occasional sharp crack of leather against skin made her flinch and curl inward. She had learned to count the seconds, to anticipate the blows before they fell, to shrink herself until she was almost invisible. She remembered the night she decided she had to leave. The memory came in flashes, the frantic packing of a single bag, the whispered prayers to herself to be brave, the muffled sobs she stifled in the darkness. Her heart had thumped violently as she opened the door, inch by inch, terrified the sound would alert the one who had caused her so much pain. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to reach for her, every creak of the floorboards a warning. She had pressed her hand against the doorknob for what felt like an eternity, willing herself not to tremble. And then, finally, she had slipped into the night, barefoot, leaving behind everything that had been familiar, even if that familiarity had been laced with fear. Her flight had not been graceful. Her legs had burned with exhaustion, her palms scraped and raw from gripping fences and window ledges, her body battered and sore. She had stumbled through fields, hidden in the shadows of barns, and slept in abandoned sheds, always alert to the threat of discovery. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bark, had sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had feared for her life, not just from him, but from the world itself, which could be just as cruel, just as quick to punish her for daring to survive. Tears prickled again as she remembered the small kindnesses she had denied herself along the way, the relief of finding water in a stream, the brief warmth of the sun on her back without fear of someone's anger following her. Each fleeting comfort had been a reminder that she was alive, but alive only in fragments, never whole. She had learned to move silently, speak rarely, and trust no one, because to trust was to risk everything. And yet, in that long, grueling escape, she had also discovered a strange and stubborn resilience. A part of her had whispered, even in the darkest moments, that she could survive this, that she could reach a place where she might finally breathe without fear. Her gaze lifted to the dusty street again, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to notice the rancher fully. He was still there, kneeling slightly, patient and unthreatening, as if he had waited all this time for her to gather the courage to see him. She realized the significance of this moment. She had come so far, traversed so much pain. And yet here was someone offering a simple act of humanity acknowledgement without judgment. She felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen fractionally. The memory of her ordeal, as painful as it was, no longer held her hostage in the present. She had carried the weight of it alone for too long. And now she could sense that perhaps she didn't have to anymore. Perhaps she could allow herself, for the first time, to step out of survival mode and into something resembling life. She pressed the handkerchief to her face again, inhaling its faint scent of cloth and leather, grounding herself in the present. The rancher had not spoken in that stretch of memory, but his patience had mirrored the gentleness she had longed for in her past. And in that moment, she understood that her journey had not ended with the flight from her old life. It had simply brought her to the threshold of a new one, where trust, however fragile, could begin to grow. She blinked, tears spilling freely, and for the first time allowed herself to hope, not blindly, not recklessly, but with the quiet courage of someone who had endured, survived, and now had the chance to be seen without fear. The quiet of the street lingered, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the wooden eaves of the buildings. She sat still, clutching the handkerchief, her knuckles white, as if holding on could somehow anchor her to a sense of safety she had not known in weeks. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him fully, not with fear, but with careful observation. He didn't move suddenly, didn't demand her attention or compliance. He simply waited, patient, as if he had understood the language of silence, the weight of trauma, and the fragile rhythm of someone learning to trust again. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, deliberate, and careful. "You look like you've been through a storm," he said softly, without accusation, without judgment. His eyes met hers, steady but kind. "You don't have to face it alone." She flinched at the words, not because they were unkind, but because the notion of not being alone was alien. Trust had been a dangerous thing in her world. To rely on someone had always meant risk, betrayal, more bruises, more pain. Yet, something in the tone of his voice, something in the calm strength of his presence, made her pause. The knots in her chest tightened, then loosened fractionally, as if the very idea of being seen without judgment was slowly dissolving the armor she had carried for so long. She shifted slightly, her bare feet pressing into the rough wood beneath her. I don't know if I can," she admitted quietly, almost a whisper. The words were heavy, not just with fear, but with the weight of months spent surviving. I'm not used to people being nice." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe it's been a long time since anyone has shown you kindness," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But it doesn't mean you don't deserve it." The handkerchief still rested in her hands. A simple token, yet it had become a bridge, tiny, fragile, but tangible. Slowly, she allowed herself to take a deep breath, feeling the rough, splintered boards beneath her shift as she leaned slightly back, letting a fraction of her weight settle where it would not collapse her entirely. Her body, so accustomed to tension, began to release just a little. He knelt slightly lower, not forcing proximity but matching her tentative movement toward trust. "You can rest here if you want," he said, nodding to the step beside her. "Take your time. No one's going to rush you." She hesitated, glancing at the board that would allow her to sit properly rather than perch uncomfortably on the edge. The idea of resting, of allowing herself to breathe without immediately scanning for threats, was both frightening and alluring. Her hand tightened briefly around the cloth, then released it. Slowly, cautiously, she eased herself down beside him, her bruised legs folded beneath her. Each movement carried a small sting of pain, but the presence of someone who did not judge or hurry her made the ache more bearable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the dust around them, lifting it into small golden clouds in the light of the setting sun. She allowed herself to notice details she had long ignored: the warmth of the air against her skin, the muted colors of the town, the subtle scent of leather and earth that seemed to emanate from him. These were small things, insignificant in another context, but to her, they were profound markers of a world she had almost forgotten could exist, a world without constant fear. He glanced at her then, not inquisitively, not pressing, but with quiet awareness. "I don't need to know your story right now," he said. "I just want you to know you're safe for as long as you need to be." The words sank in slowly, their impact gentle but undeniable. Safe. The notion had been so distant, almost mythic in her life, that she almost didn't recognize it. Her lips parted slightly, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she whispered, the words fragile, almost tremulous, yet genuine. It was not just gratitude, it was acknowledgement, a small offering of trust, the first spark of connection she had dared to give since her flight. He nodded. A quiet affirmation, and a subtle shift occurred in the space between them. The tension, though still present, was less sharp, less insurmountable. The first thread of trust had been woven, a fragile bridge over the jagged terrain of fear, pain, and solitude she had carried for so long. For the first time since fleeing the past that had hunted her, she felt something she had almost forgotten: not relief, not safety entirely, but the possibility of hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to be seen, and not merely for survival, but for the first step toward living. And as the last light of the sun kissed the rooftops, she allowed herself a small, tentative exhale, a fragile acknowledgement that this moment, this simple, quiet moment of being allowed to exist without fear, might be the beginning of something entirely new. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the dusty street. The wind had softened, carrying only the faint scent of earth and distant hay, and the quiet seemed to stretch around them like a protective shroud. She still sat on the edge of the boardwalk, clutching the handkerchief to her chest, her legs folded awkwardly beneath her. The bruises on her arms and legs throbbed with a dull ache, each pulse a reminder of the ordeal she had endured. And yet, she no longer flinched at his presence. The rancher remained kneeling nearby, not imposing but patient, his gaze steady and unyielding in its gentleness. His eyes met hers not with judgment, not with pity, but with something she had not allowed herself to feel for a long time: acknowledgement. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her defenses, and she found herself realizing, in the quiet of that golden hour, that this man saw her fully, scars and all. He took a slow breath and shifted slightly, lowering himself until he was at her level. The movement was deliberate, careful, as though he understood that proximity could either comfort or terrify her. "You don't have to hide," he said softly. His voice was almost a whisper, yet it carried through the quiet like a tether to something real, something safe. "Not here, not with me. I see you." The simplicity of the statement struck her. She blinked, her throat tight, and for the first time, she considered the possibility that she might be allowed to exist without fear of reproach, without the ever-present weight of judgment pressing down on her. "I'm seen. I'm allowed to be here." The thought felt almost alien, as though she had stumbled into a world that was not hostile, not demanding, not cruel. Her hands gripped the handkerchief tighter, pressing it to her lips almost unconsciously, as though holding on to it might somehow anchor her to this fragile sense of safety. The rancher did not speak again immediately. He simply waited, letting her absorb the moment, letting her realize that she did not need to vanish, to shrink, or to hide. The silence was not oppressive. It was deliberate, a gift of patience that she had long been denied. Slowly, she let her eyes travel across his face, taking in the rough lines shaped by years of sun and wind, the faint dust clinging to his coat, the gentleness in the curve of his mouth, and the calm steadiness of his gaze. He did not demand explanation, did not press for her story, did not flinch from the bruises that marred her skin. He simply saw. And that realization, so simple yet profound, loosened the tension that had coiled around her chest for months. Tears threatened to spill again, but this time they were not entirely born of fear. They were a release or recognition that for the first time someone had chosen to witness her pain without turning away. Her lips trembled and she whispered, almost to herself, I'm allowed to be here?" "Yes," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You are allowed to be here. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to breathe. You don't have to pretend or hide. Not with me." The words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, strange and comforting in their quiet certainty. She had spent so long running, hiding, and surviving, always imagining the next threat, always anticipating the judgment or the blow that might come next. And yet, here was someone offering something entirely new, acceptance without condition. She could feel the weight of her fear lifting, even if only slightly, and the ache of her bruises felt less oppressive in that moment of acknowledgement. Her chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, and she realized, with a trembling clarity, that she wanted to trust him not blindly, not without caution, but enough to allow herself to step forward, even slightly, from the edges of her own fear. The moment stretched, suspended between them, golden and fragile, until she finally let the handkerchief drop from her hands to rest on her lap. The rancher's gaze softened, and he offered a small, encouraging nod. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "No rush, no pressure." "I'll be right here." Something in her shifted then, the first real spark of courage since her escape. She lifted her chin slightly, the gesture small, almost imperceptible, but monumental in its significance. She was beginning to understand that being seen did not always mean being hurt. That acknowledgement could be a bridge, not a weapon. That perhaps, just perhaps, she could exist alongside another person without fear, and in the quiet glow of the evening, kneeling before her with steady, unwavering patience, she allowed herself to feel it fully, the first real sense of safety in a long, long time. The sun had fully settled behind the distant hills now, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The shadows lengthened across the wooden boards of the street, and the first cool whispers of evening wind carried the scent of hay, dust, and the faint tang of smoke from a distant hearth. She remained seated on the edge of the boardwalk, her bare feet tucked beneath her, holding the handkerchief loosely in her lap. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to simply be, without scanning for threats or anticipating the next wave of pain. The rancher stayed kneeling nearby, still at her level, patient, silent, and attentive. He didn't press for conversation or explanations. He simply offered a steady presence, the kind of steady presence she had almost forgotten could exist. Each moment spent in his quiet company felt like a balm to the tension she had carried for so long. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid lines of her body began to soften. "You don't have to be afraid," he said gently, breaking the comfortable silence. "I won't leave, and I won't judge you. Not now, not ever. I just want to help." She hesitated, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The memories of her past, the anger, the abuse, the constant fear rose again, raw and immediate. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, biting it to keep herself from trembling too visibly. Her chest tightened with the familiar weight of anxiety, but something in the calm assurance of his gaze held her in place. After a long moment, she whispered, I don't know how to trust anyone anymore." He nodded, acknowledging her fear without dismissing it. "I know," he said softly. "And you don't have to trust me all at once. You don't have to trust me at all if you're not ready. You can start small, With a word, a look, or just sitting here. Something in her shifted at those words. The idea of starting small, of taking tentative steps toward trust rather than plunging blindly into it, made the concept of connection feel less impossible. She could see that he wasn't demanding her vulnerability, he was offering her the chance to give it, one piece at a time. And for the first time since her flight, she considered the possibility that she might actually want to let someone in. She let her hands fall to her lap, the handkerchief resting loosely between her fingers. Her gaze met his, unguarded for the first time. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice quivering but honest. Scared that if I let someone in, they'll hurt me. He reached out, slowly and deliberately, stopping just short of touching her. I can't change what's happened, he said softly. But I can promise you this, I won't be the one to hurt you. I can only offer what I can, my presence, my patience, my help. You can take it or leave it. No strings, no judgment. The sincerity in his voice, the calm steadiness of his gaze, and the absence of any pressure created a rare and fragile sense of safety in her chest. For the first time, she felt the possibility of connection without danger, of companionship without betrayal. A tentative spark of hope kindled within her, a small, fragile ember, but one that refused to be extinguished. Slowly, almost tentatively, she reached out her hand and rested it lightly on his. The gesture was barely perceptible, but it carried enormous significance. It was her first act of trust. A silent acknowledgement that she was willing to allow someone else to share her space, her pain, and her presence. He didn't move suddenly or grab her hand. He simply let it rest there, a quiet affirmation of her choice. That's all I ask, he said quietly. One small step at a time. Her lips trembled, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not from fear, but from the release of a tension she had carried for too long. The bruises on her arms and legs throbbed, the soreness in her body was real, but the weight of her emotional burden felt lighter, just enough for her to breathe a little easier. The wind stirred again, rustling her hair, and she leaned slightly against him, tentative, as though testing the waters of human kindness. He didn't move away. He didn't comment or draw attention to it. He simply stayed, patient and unwavering, giving her the time and space to explore this new possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope, not recklessly, not blindly, but with quiet courage. She had survived her ordeal, she had fled, and now perhaps she could begin to rebuild the fragile trust that had been shattered so long ago. And in that twilight-drenched street, with shadows stretching across the boards and the first stars beginning to appear, she realized that the journey forward would not be easy, but it was hers to take, and for the first time, she felt the possibility that she didn't have to take it alone. The night had fully settled over the town, and the first stars pricked the dark sky like distant lanterns. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint, comforting scent of earth and hay from nearby pastures. The street was quiet, empty except for the two of them, the bruised, barefoot woman and the rancher who had offered patience, presence, and above all, understanding. She rose slowly from the edge of the boardwalk, each step sending a jolt of pain through her sore feet. Yet this time, the ache felt different. It was not only a reminder of past suffering, but also of survival, of endurance, of every step she had taken to reach this point. She shifted the handkerchief in her hands, now dry and soft, a symbol of her tentative connection to someone who had chosen to see her and stay. He remained kneeling slightly, not pressing her, not urging her forward. His eyes met hers, calm and steady, radiating reassurance. For the first time, she felt that she could meet someone's gaze without shrinking or lowering her head in shame. She could be seen, not merely tolerated, but truly seen. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, his voice a soft anchor in the cool night. She hesitated. her toes brushing the rough boards beneath her, then nodded. It wasn't a resounding yes, it was fragile, tentative, like the first sprout of green after a long winter, but it was enough. Enough to take a step, enough to begin trusting, enough to begin believing that life could hold something beyond pain and fear. Her bare feet touched the warm dust of the street as she stepped forward. Careful at first, each movement deliberate. The rancher rose with her, matching her pace, but never crowding her, never rushing. They moved together slowly, as if learning a new rhythm, a new language of trust and presence. Each step was a quiet affirmation. I am here. I survived. I can move forward. The town seemed to notice the shift too. Windows glimmered with faint lamplight, and the distant sound of an evening hearth added a sense of warmth to the empty street. Yet the world beyond the town no longer felt threatening. For the first time, she believed in the possibility of safety, of belonging, of choosing to step into life rather than hiding from it. He extended a hand toward her, not commanding, not demanding, but offering a simple gesture of partnership. She paused for a heartbeat, feeling the thrum of her pulse, the echo of past fears whispering in her mind. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without effort, without expectation, as though they had been waiting for this connection all along. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but sincere. Not for rescuing her, not for fixing her, but for seeing her. For waiting. For giving her the space to be herself without fear. He nodded, a quiet, gentle acknowledgement, his grip firm but kind. "No need to thank me," he replied. "You did the hard part, you survived. You're still here. That's what matters." She glanced down at her bare feet, then back at him, and allowed herself a small, tentative smile. The bruises, the scars, the raw edges of her experience, none of them had vanished, but they no longer defined her entirely. They were part of her story, yes, but she could carry them forward with courage, not only with pain. The first stars shone brighter overhead, casting their silver light across the street, and a cool breeze lifted her hair. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, tasting the night air like it was the first breath of freedom she had truly taken. The horizon beyond the town, once filled with uncertainty and danger, now seemed open, full of possibility. Step by step, she moved forward, each one steadier than the last. The rancher stayed beside her, a quiet companion and protector, matching her pace but never overtaking it. They walked together into the street's open stretch, the night embracing them like an unspoken promise that the future, though uncertain, could be shared, could be faced, could be lived. And in that soft, starlit silence, she understood something she had almost forgotten, that survival was not merely escaping harm. Survival was choosing to move forward despite fear. Survival was allowing herself to hope, to trust, to connect. Survival was letting someone see her and choosing to stay seen. Her hand tightened slightly around his as they walked. A small but profound gesture, a silent declaration that she was no longer hiding. The town, the darkness, the past, they were behind her now. Ahead was something she had never dared to imagine, a life where she could be bruised, vulnerable, and barefoot and still be met with care, kindness, and unwavering presence. Step by step, shadow by shadow, she moved forward, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the quiet certainty of possibility. The journey had not ended, it had only begun, but this time she would not face it alone.